So let's now make sure we can listen to a click on this delete button. In vanilla JavaScript, so in just JavaScript without React, we would find a way of selecting this button, for example with document query selector button. And then once we got hold of this DOM object, we could add a click listener with add event listener. Now this is again an imperative approach. We describe what should happen. With React, we rather use a declarative approach describing the target result. And hence this is not code we write in React. Instead, with React, if we want to listen to a click on this button, we add an extra attribute on this button. And for this, it's important to understand that all these default HTML elements are in the end also just React components. Just React components that are built into React already. So they look like regular HTML elements and you use them like regular HTML elements, but under the hood, these are components. And that matters because that means that you can add certain attributes which you could not add like this, at least with just HTML. For example, on a button, or actually on any HTML element here in JSX, you can add an onClick attribute written like this: lowercase o, uppercase C, and the casing does matter. Unlike in regular HTML, here it does matter. Now when you add the onClick prop, as it's called, as you learned, to a button or to any other element, you're telling React that you want to react to a click on that element. Now, the value you assign for this attribute is then not some text, not a string, but instead a dynamic expression which should hold a function that should be executed when a click occurs. So here we could define an anonymous inline function like this, or also with the arrow function syntax, which you can use in modern JavaScript, or you point at another function. And I'll do the latter. I'll create a new function, and, important, I'll create it as a nested function inside of the to-do function. And that might look weird, but that's actually standard JavaScript. In JavaScript, also without React, you can define functions inside of functions. So here I'll add a function inside of the to-do function, inside of that to-do function component, and we could name this delete handler. The function name is totally up to you. I personally like this convention where functions which are executed upon events end with handler, but other people don't use that, but instead might use handle delete or just delete. Totally up to you. I'll go with delete handler here and then point at this function as a value here for this onClick prop, simply by repeating the function name here. And now here is an extremely important thing to keep in mind. You don't execute the function here, so no parentheses. If you would execute it here, this function would be executed as soon as JavaScript and React evaluates this code. So when this line of code is evaluated, the function would execute. Now that is too early though. We want to execute the function when the button is clicked, not when that code is evaluated by JavaScript, because that happens right before that content is rendered in the browser. Hence, we just point at this function by just using its name here, and that just tells React in the end that it's this function that should be executed when this element is clicked. And now in here we can do whatever we want. For example, we can console log clicked here for the moment. And if we do that and save this, if I go to the JavaScript console in the DevTools, if we click one of these delete buttons, doesn't matter which one you click, you see clicked. Now we could also output clicked and then as an extra log props.text, so that text value which we receive via props, which I also output down there in the h2 tag. I'm now referring to it again here, because this is just standard JavaScript in the end, even though this JSX code definitely doesn't look like it. But up here, we write standard JavaScript, and hence, of course, here we can also use one of our arguments. And if that argument turns out to be an object, which props is, we can also drill into that object here. And with that, if I save this and click delete, you see the proper text being output here as well. And maybe it's not clear here, but that's another strength of React. Without any extra work from our side, these 3 different buttons are doing different things. I mean, they're always doing the same thing. We just defined this logic once, but the concrete values with which they work, the concrete text which they output, is not the same. Instead, it's different for every button. And that means that we can easily write logic that's specific to a specific to-do, whilst still being able to define this logic once instead of 3 times, which is great and makes our code way more reusable. But of course, here the goal is not to log something to the console. Instead, we want to show a little overlay when that button is clicked. And for this, of course, we need to, first of all, create that overlay. We need to create the HTML code that should be showing up. And then as a second step, we also need to find a way of showing it conditionally. Now let's start with creating the code for the overlay. For this, I'll add a new component. We could add the code in the existing component, but it is considered a good practice to put every building block into its own file, every component into its file, and to avoid very long JSX blocks by instead splitting it up into separate components. Now, when you should make a split, that's something which will come with experience, and you'll see a couple of examples throughout this course here. But in general, you want to keep your component functions small and maintainable. The JSX code that belongs to a component shouldn't become too complex. And therefore, I'll add a new file in the components folder, and I'll name it modal.js, because that's the component that should be responsible for rendering a modal, this overlay. That's typically called a modal. And in here, we therefore create another function, the modal function, and we export this function like this. And here we can also accept this props parameter. As I mentioned, every component function gets this parameter. It's passed in automatically by React. But of course, if you don't use this parameter in a function, if you don't use it in a given component, you can also omit it. And here, for the moment, I will omit it. Then we need to return something here, something which can be rendered by the browser, as we learned. And for me, that will be another div. And in that div, we can then have a paragraph, let's say, with a text of "Are you sure?" or something like this. And below that, let's say 2 buttons. One button where we say cancel, and one button where we say confirm. Now in this demo, the buttons won't really do anything except for closing the modal. But of course, in a bigger application, you could then trigger different actions based on which button was clicked. But again, that's just a first demo. We're going to see a slightly bigger app thereafter in this course. So for the moment, it's this div. Let me format this with a paragraph and 2 buttons. Now we want to add some styling. So on that div, I'll add a class name, as you learned, of modal. And on the buttons, I'll also add some class names. On the cancel button, it's button, and then another class named button-alt. And these are simply classes defined in the index CSS file I provided to you earlier. And then here on the second button, it's just a button. And that's now the markup for this overlay component. Now, in addition to this overlay, we also want to have a backdrop, some gray background behind the modal, which blocks interaction with the page whilst the modal is opened. And for this, I'll add another component, the backdrop component, in a backdrop.js file. And that will also be a straightforward component, simply a backdrop function here, like this. And then we export this as a default. And here I just want to return a div with a class name of backdrop. This div has no content, and therefore we can write it as a self-closing tag actually. In standard HTML, you would not write it like this. Their divs are not void tags. But in JSX, you are allowed to do that if you have no actual content between the opening and closing tags. And here I just render this div because of this styling, which is added by this class, and hence I need no content, and hence we can write it like a self-closing tag. Okay, so now we got the backdrop and the modal. Now we can use both, and for the moment, we will always show both. So for the moment, we can go to app.js, for example, and below all these to-dos, we can now also output the modal as a self-closing tag like this, and the backdrop as a self-closing tag like this. And we again need to import these two component functions in order to use them here. So we import modal from /components modal, and we import backdrop from /components backdrop like this. If you now save all your files, you should see something like this. Let me zoom out a bit. Something like this. This is our modal. And at the moment, it's always visible and we can't close it. Because that's now one big missing piece. We know how to build components, how to build reusable components, and how to build our interface. But at this point, our interface is 100% static. It never changes. What we output here, that never changes. No matter how we interact with it as a user, the interface always stays the same. And of course, that's typically not what you want in a web interface. Things should be interactive and things should change. That's one of the main reasons for using a library like React. And therefore, let's now explore how React makes sure that we can change what we see after the page was loaded. In order to change what's visible on the screen, we need to change the state of this app, so to say. Now, attached you find an extra article and video which I created where I explain what state is. In the end, you can take it quite literally though. The current state of this application is that we have 3 to-dos and this overlay is open. Now, we would like to also be able to present another state where this overlay is closed. And we want to switch between the states. When we click on delete, then it should open. And when we click on cancel or confirm or the backdrop, it should close. So that should be our ways of switching between the states. And React has a built-in concept that helps us with that. And conveniently, it's called state. For this, let's go to our to-do.js file, to our to-do component. Here we got this delete handler, this function which is triggered when the delete button is clicked. When it is clicked, we would like to switch to the state where the modal is open. To make that happen, we need to import some functionality from the React library. So we import from React. Important here, we have node./ because React is a third-party library. You import from those by just referencing the library name. And then we import something like this with curly braces. We import the useState function. That is a function exposed by the React library, which we can use in our component functions. With useState, we register different states which we want to support in our React application, and React will react to changes in that state and allow us as a developer to render different output depending on which state is active. Now, that all starts with calling useState directly in our component function like this. So not inside of the delete handler, instead directly in the component function. useState is a so-called React hook, and those React hooks can only be called directly in React component functions and in custom hooks, which is a topic we'll not discuss in this course, but which is discussed in depth in my complete guide as well. For the moment, it's enough that we know that we can use React hooks in React component functions. Now, calling useState creates a state React is aware of. Now, we can give this state a starting value by passing it here as an argument to useState, and that could be false if our state is that we want to control whether the modal is open or not. And initially, it should not be open, so the initial state is false. Now, useState always returns an array with exactly 2 elements. That's how useState works. It always returns an array with 2 elements, and we can store this returned array in a constant, or we use array destructuring, which is a JavaScript feature, to store these 2 elements, since we know that it will be always 2 elements, in different constants. And we could give the first constant a name of show modal or modal is open or anything like this. And the second element here, the second constant, a name of set modal is open. Now, why did I choose these names? Because the first element, which useState returns in its array, is the current state snapshot. So this value which is stored in this state. You can think of React state as a variable which is managed for you by React. You define the initial value here, and you will then also be able to change that value. Now you get access to the currently stored value through this first element here. The second element is a function that allows you to change that value. Because you don't change it by assigning a new value to modal is open, instead you always call this second function to assign a new value. Why does this matter? Because whenever you call this state changing function, React will in the end re-execute the component function to which this state belongs and re-evaluate it, and also update what's rendered on the screen. This allows you to pick up the latest state value and possibly render something different depending on the state. Now, this might still be a bit abstract. It will become crystal clear in a couple of seconds. What we can do now with these 2 elements is that in delete handler, we call set modal is open and set this to true to change that modal is open state from false, which is our initial state, to true. And then we use modal is open to conditionally render the modal and backdrop down there in this JSX code. So I go to app.js and I remove modal and backdrop from there and remove the imports since we're not using modal and backdrop in this file anymore. And instead I'll go to to-do.js and import modal there from /modal and import backdrop here from /backdrop, constructing the relative paths to these files as seen from inside this to-do.js file. And since modal and backdrop are neighbors to this file, the paths look just like this. And then we can use these components down here. Let's say here in that div, modal and backdrop. Now, if we add it like this, they would always be rendered. I only want to render them if modal is open is true, if that state has a value of true. Now we are changing the state here. To use it, we can simply output a dynamic expression down here and check if modal is open is truthy, like this, and then write a ternary expression where if this is true, we render modal. And that might look strange, but that is code which you can write, else we don't output anything. So we render null. This certainly looks strange, but that is how you can render content conditionally with React and JSX. In these dynamic expressions between the curly braces, you can again use JSX, and that's what I'm doing here. So I'm checking if modal is open is true, and if it is, I render the modal, otherwise I don't render anything. And we can actually use a short trick or shortcut here and use the double ampersand, the logical AND operator here, like this, to simply use the fact that in JavaScript, if you use this operator, if both conditions are true, the second value will be returned. So if that is true, and that is true, and a function, a component function will always be true, then this component function is output here. And that's simply shorter than writing this ternary expression. We can now repeat that modal is open check here for the backdrop, and with that, we only output modal and backdrop if modal is open is true, and not if it's false. And we do this for every to-do component. So if we save this file as well now, we don't see the modal right now, but if we click on delete, we see it. And now we can't interact with the rest of this page because of this backdrop. So that's a great step forward. How can we now get rid of that modal though? To get rid of the modal and the backdrop now, we need to change the state again. From set modal is open true to false. We need to call set modal is open again and pass false as a value. The problem just is, when do we want to do that? We want to do that when the backdrop is clicked or when the cancel or confirm buttons are clicked. We don't want to do that if the modal itself is clicked, for example. Now for the backdrop click, you could think that on backdrop, you simply add on click again, and then we add a second function here, the close modal handler, let's say. And there we call set modal is open and set this to false. And then we point at this close modal handler here as a value for on click, just as we did it with the button in the end. But that won't work. If we save that and I reload, I can click the backdrop the entire day, the modal won't close. The reason for this is that the backdrop, like the modal, is our own component. These are not built-in components. So they don't know the on-click prop. Our own components have to be configured 100% by us. They have no built-in props which we can use. To be precise, they actually do, but only for some very special cases and not for event listeners like this. So if we want to make sure that an on-click prop exists in the backdrop component, we have to add code to this component function to support this prop. And for this, we can go to the component function and accept this props argument here, this props parameter. And then here, we can of course work with an on-click prop or any other name we want. It's totally up to you because it's our component. But here we can, for example, expect an on-click prop because I'm setting this here in the to-do component. And we actually expect a function as a value on this on-click prop. Because in the to-do component, I do pass in a function in the end. I point at a function, which means I pass a pointer to the function as a value for this prop. Now, in the backdrop component, we actually want to call this function, which we receive on the on-click prop, when this div is clicked. Now, the div is a built-in component again, so it does have on-click prop. And now we could simply point at props on-click as a value here. By doing this, we would in the end forward the function which we receive on our props here, on our on-click prop, into that div on its on-click prop. And these names don't have to be equal. We could expect an on-cancel prop here instead, and in to-do component rename this to on-cancel. It's our component, so we can name this however we want. Now, if we do that and save all the files, if I reload, now we can close the modal by clicking the backdrop. Because now we're using a prop to pass a function as a value. And that's a pattern which can be confusing and might look strange at first, but keep in mind that in JavaScript, functions are first-class objects. You can pass them around as values just as you can pass strings and arrays and objects and numbers as values. Hence, you can pass a function as an argument to another function and therefore also as a value for a prop to another component. And then that function which we receive in that component can be executed in that component, or as we're doing it here, it can be forwarded to yet another element, another component. Now we can use that same approach in the modal component for canceling and confirming. There we could add functions like the cancel handler and then let's say the confirm handler and kick off different logic depending on which button was clicked. But in this case, I'll simply, in the end, run the same code in both functions. Nonetheless, we can bind the first button with the onClick prop to cancel handler. And here it has to be onClick because that's not a custom component, but a built-in one. So here we can't come up with any other name. And for the confirm button, I'll also add onClick and point at the confirm handler. And now in these functions, we can run any code we want. In this case, though, I also want to just close the modal. So again, I'll just accept the props parameter here. And in cancel handler, I'll just execute props on cancel, let's say. In the confirm handler, I'll execute props on confirm. And hence, instead of defining these functions here and pointing at them here, we could have also just forwarded props on cancel here like this, just as we did it for the backdrop. I'm just showing this alternative approach to make it crystal clear that you can execute these functions which you receive through props. You can forward them to other elements if that's what you need to do, but you can also execute them anywhere in your components. And hence I'm using this alternative setup with these extra wrapper functions at which I then point here. And now we got an onCancel and an onConfirm prop, which are expected on that modal component. So in the place where we use the modal component, we should add onCancel and onConfirm. And here in both cases, I'll just point at the close modal handler, because as mentioned before, here I got no special logic, I just want to close the modal. With that, if we save this and reload, we can not just close the modal by clicking the backdrop, but also by clicking cancel or by clicking confirm. And that works for every to-do here. For all to-dos, the modal works in the same way. And that's therefore another very important building block of React. Props are important for building reusable components. State is important for changing what we see on the screen dynamically, for adding or removing elements, for changing text on the screen, or, like in this case, for showing and hiding an overlay. So now that we picked up those important React basics, it's time to dig a bit deeper, to dive into some advanced concepts like routing, sending HTTP requests, and application-wide state management, and what all these things are. We're going to explore that. And for this, we're going to leave this basic project, this basic demo we worked on. Instead, we're going to build this meetup demo application I showed you earlier already. And for that, I cleaned up my project. I removed basically all the imports and all the content from this app file here. And index.css has some new content. You find my updated project attached. So there you also find the updated index.css file. And I deleted all the components. Now, as I just said, you find this updated starting state attached, and you can therefore then start with that same project. In the end here, once you downloaded it, you need to run npm install again. Then once that's done, you can npm start this project again to bring up that development server again. And that will give you a blank page. Because now we're going to build this project from the ground up, and this project will now involve more components than the previous one, and it will involve the important concept of routing. Now, what does routing mean? Consider this Netflix example from before again. There I went to the My List page to view the items I added to my list. Now, it looks like I visited a totally different page, but if you watch this refresh icon in the top left corner, you see that it never changes. It never goes into that loading mode. Because actually, we never fetched a new HTML page. The page loaded by the browser never changed. We always stay on that single page. And that's the case for Netflix because they also have such a single page application. It should also be the case for our project now. I want to give the user the illusion of having different pages to which we can navigate whilst actually staying on one and the same page and leaving it up to React to change what's visible on the page. The advantage of this approach is that we never have to wait for a new page to be loaded. Instead, we can always stay fast, stay reactive, because everything is handled by client-side JavaScript, which is faster than sending a new request to a server. And that can really enhance the user experience. Now, therefore, we want to add something which is called routing to our project. We want to add a router, a special tool which actually watches changes in the URL and then changes what's visible on the screen based on the URL. So which basically gives us a way of giving our users this illusion of routing. And for this, I'll actually quit this development server again and install a new dependency, a new third-party package into this project. We do this with npm install, with the npm install command, but now not just executed like this, but instead we now add a package name thereafter. The name of the package which should be installed, so downloaded, into this project here. And that's the react-router-dom package. That's a package which, as the name kind of implies, allows us to add routing functionality to React. So it allows us to handle URLs and change what's visible on the screen without fetching new HTML pages. Simply hit enter and this package will be installed. And in package.json, you'll see that a new entry was added. So that file was automatically updated, which means that if you now share this project again without a node modules folder and someone then runs just npm install again, that newly added package will also be picked up and installed because it is part of this package.json file. Now we don't need to do this here because we just did install it. So we can run npm start again to bring up that development server again. And now we can add routing. But what does this mean? What does add routing mean? In the end, it means that we need to add this routing tool to our code so that we have this thing watching for URL changes. And we need to let this thing, this tool, know which component should be loaded as a page for which route, for which URL. And for this, I'll start by adding a new folder next to the components folder inside the src folder, and that's the pages folder. You don't have to add this folder and you don't have to name it pages, but in the end here, this is a good way of differentiating and of separating our components that are embedded in other components, which will be stored in the components folder, from the components that will be loaded as pages. Technically, we'll build components in the same way, no matter how we use them. But for us as a developer, to have an easier time to quickly find the right component we want to work on, I'll separate them into these two folders. And in the pages folder, we're now going to add a couple of React components, which again will be built just like all the other components, but which will be loaded by this router we just installed when certain URLs are visited. And here for this application, for this project we're building here, I'll add a all meetups.js file. So a component that will be responsible for loading and displaying all the meetups we have. I'll add a new meetup.js file, and I'll add a favorites.js file. New meetup will allow us to add a new meetup later, and favorites.js will allow us to view our favorited meetups, because we'll add a functionality that allows us to bookmark, to favorite a meetup as a user. But step by step, for the moment, I'll just set up some dummy components in these three files. And I'll start with all meetups, and I'll name this component function all meetups page. You can name it however you want. I'll just choose this name to make it clear that this component will be used as a page that's loaded by this router. Now, just as all the other components we built before, this component has to be exported, and it needs to return some JSX code. And for the moment, I'll just return a div where I say all meetups page. That's of course not the final content, but some starting content for now. Then we can copy this and add it in the favorites file here. So this is the favorites page, and we want to export the favorites page. And here I'll then say favorites page, and then save this and copy this into new meetup and name this new meetup page, and also use that name for exporting. And here we say new meetup page. Now we got these three page components. Now we need to use that router package to define when which page should be loaded. And for this, we first of all need to go to Next.js and wrap our app component, which we render here, with another component. For this, we need to import something from react-router-dom. And that something which we import is the browser router, like this. Now it turns out that browser router is in the end a component itself. And therefore we can use it as a HTML element, opening and closing tags, and wrap those tags around the app component. Now that is something we haven't seen up to this point, that a non-standard component, so a non-HTML component, would be wrapped around something, but it is something we can do, and it is something we are doing here. We're going to learn how we make our own components wrappable a little bit later in this course. So now we initialize this router package. We make it aware of this app, and we ensure that it watches our URL, so to say. Now, as a next step, we need to define the URLs we want to support and which pages should be loaded for the different URLs. And we do this in the app component now, so in this wrapped component. In there, we return a div, and we can leave it like this. But now in this div, I want to return or use other components which are also imported from React Router DOM. So we also import React Router DOM here, and here we import the route component. So just like browser router, route is a component, and we use it like a component, but the job of the route component is to define different paths in the URL we want to listen to, and which component should be loaded for these different paths. And therefore, I will also already import my three page components here, the all meetups page from /pages all meetups, and then the new meetup page from .pages new meetup, and of course also the favorites page component from /pages favorites. And now in this div here, we can use the route component, which I'm importing from React Router DOM, and give it a path prop, a path attribute. Now path takes a string, and that will be the path in the URL after your domain. So in our case, our domain is, for example, localhost 3000. That's our domain. Of course, on a real server after deployment, that would be something like mypage.com. And now the part after the domain is the path. That can be just a slash, so no path at all in the end, or it can be something like /favorites or /products or anything like that. So the part after the domain is the path, and here we define for which path which component should be loaded. And here we can start with /nothing to handle the default path that we just visited our domain /nothing. And then between these route tags, we actually do now add the component that should be loaded, like the all meetups page like this, because that should be the starting page actually. We can add another route here for, let's say, /new-meetup, and the path is up to you. If we now visit mydomain.com/new-meetup, then the component which we render between these route tags will be loaded. And that could be the new meetups page. And last but not least, we can also define a route for the path /favorites and then render the favorites page like this. Now we're defining 3 routes, and instead of this content here, the actual page component will be rendered if that route determines that the current URL matches this path. So if we are on mydomain.com/new-meetup, this new meetup page component would be rendered and not the favorites page, for example. So if we save this and we go back and reload localhost 3000, we should see the all meetups page here. But if we go to favorites, for example, we see favorites page as well. But wait a second, is this the desired result, that we see it as well? Well, it depends. In some applications, depending on what you build, you might want such a nested page so that the page for just //nothing is rendered, but also this specific page for /favorites. We see this output because by default, React Router matches all your paths, and it simply checks if the current path includes these paths here. And /favorites includes both /favorites as well as just /, which is why both components are rendered. Again, that could be what you want, but often it's not. That's why there is another component provided by React Router DOM which helps us, and that's the switch component. We can use the switch component to wrap all our route components like this, and with that we tell React Router that only one of these routes should be active, so at most one of these pages should be rendered. If we do that and save this, we don't see 2 components being rendered, but we don't see the correct component being rendered either. Instead, for /favorites, we now see all meetups. And the reason for this is now how your routes are matched. React Router by default checks if the path of the current URL starts with the paths defined here. And because of switch, it will then stop looking at the other routes as soon as it has a hit, as soon as it finds a match. Now, of course, /favorites starts with just /, and then because of switch, it doesn't look any further, and therefore all meetups is rendered. That's not what we want, and we can prevent this by adding the exact prop here on route and setting this to true. Though you can also shorten this, and if you have a prop which you just want to set to a truthy value, you can just add the prop name like this. So we add the exact prop and set it to true to this first route. And the exact prop tells React Router that for this route, it should not check if the path begins with this path, but if the full path matches this path. And that's now, of course, not the case for /favorites. So this will not create a match, and it will continue looking, and it will ultimately find this route for /favorites. So now we see the favorites page. For new-meetup, we see the new meetup page. And for just localhost 3000, we see the all meetups page. And that's how we can add routing. But of course, at the moment, we're just navigating around by entering URLs manually. And that's not very realistic. In reality, we would probably want some header, some navigation bar at the top which provides different links. And therefore, that is what we're going to add next. Now let's take care about adding such a navigation bar to our application. And for this, I'll go to the components folder and add a new folder in there And I'll name it layout because it will hold some general layout components. So a subfolder inside of components. And in there, I'll add the main navigation.js file, which is the file that should hold this main navigation component. Now I added it here in the components folder and not in the pages folder because this component will not be loaded as a page with help of the router, but instead we will embed it in the content of our other code just as we did before, totally unrelated to the router. Now in this main navigation component file, we can again define our component function, main navigation, and export it as we're used to, and then of course return some JSX content here. And here I want to return a header component, which in the end will then wrap all the items that should go into this header. And here I actually want to have a div first with my logo, which in this case will just be some text. I'll name it React Meetups. And then next to this div, inside of the header, I'll add a nav element. And here I'll then add an unordered list with a couple of list items, where all those list items will be the different links which we have here. Now, when it comes to those links, we typically render links by using the anchor tag. That's how we do that in standard HTML. We could do this here as well, but using that link component, that link element, has one big disadvantage. If we use a link like this, whenever we click it, a new request will be sent to the server. The server here is the server hosting this React application, and indeed that server would then reply with our application, and there the router would figure out which page to load. So a link would work, but we sent this request first, which is redundant. We already are in our running React application, and it would be great if we don't leave it just because we want to navigate somewhere. Hence, sending that extra request is not something we necessarily want to do. That's why instead of this anchor tag, we instead use another component provided by the React Router DOM package. So we again import from React Router DOM, and we import the link component here. The link component can be wrapped around our link text, just like the anchor tag, and it will render an anchor tag in the end, but internally, React Router DOM attaches a click listener to the anchor tag, and when you click on it, it will prevent that browser default of sending a request, and instead just parse the URL you want to go to, change it in the browser URL bar, but then not send a request, but instead load the appropriate component onto the screen just with React and JavaScript, so that we stay on this already loaded page and we don't send this extra request. So that's why we add links like this. Now, of course, here that should not be some link, but a link to all the meetups, let's say. And to make link aware of the URL it should navigate to, we have to set the to prop here. This is one of the expected props on the link component. And here we set a path, in this case just /nothing, because that is the path to the all meetups page. Now we can replicate this and add two more list items, where the second one leads to /new meetup and says new meetup, or add new meetup. That's up to you, of course. And on the last link, we go to /favorites and we say favorites or my favorites, something like this. Now we got those links in place and we got this main navigation component. We can now use this in the app.js file, and there we can now import main navigation from /components/layout/main navigation and add this above that switch statement. Here we can add main navigation as a self-closing tag still, if we want to. If we save this, we'll see some navigation here. And if we click those links, they work. The styling is missing, but we got working links. We got a working navigation. Now I want to add some styling, and for this we're going to explore a different way of styling our components. In the first demo application we built, I gave you one CSS file that contained the styles for all components. That works for a small demo, but not necessarily for a bigger project. There, you typically want to have different CSS files for your different components. And hence the CSS file which I provided to you here is very slim. Now, when it comes to styling the different components, it would be even nicer if the styles set up in a specific CSS file would then be scoped to the component to which they belong. So it would be nice if next to main navigation, we could add, let's say, a main navigation.css file, and then define the styles in that file that belong to this main navigation.js file. And they should not affect any other component. That's something you often want because in bigger React projects, you often work with hundreds or thousands of components, and you want to make sure that your styles don't clash with each other. Now, the good thing is that Create React App, this tool which we used for creating this project, gives us a project that has a feature built in that allows us to scope styles to components. And that feature is called CSS modules. It's a behind-the-scenes code transformation which will make sure that we can attach CSS files to specific components. For this, we first of all need to name our CSS files in a certain way. We need to make sure that they end with .module.css. So in this case, the file is named main navigation.module.css. And then in main navigation.js, we can import from this CSS file. That certainly looks strange, and it's not something that would work in standard JavaScript. But since we have this extra build step here, which parses and transforms our code before it reaches the browser, we can actually import from CSS. And that is what we're already doing in Next.js, by the way. We're importing a CSS file, and behind the scenes, that will tell the build process that this CSS code should be injected into the loaded page as well. We can do the same here in main navigation.js, but now to attach this styling or this style file and its classes to this component, we don't import just main navigation.module.css like this, but instead we import something, for example, classes, this name is up to you, from this file. Now I named it classes because this something here, which we import, will actually be a JavaScript object where all the CSS classes you define in this CSS file will be properties of this object. And you can then use them in your JSX code to attach those classes to your elements. And behind the scenes, everything will be transformed such that those class names are made unique per component. So let me give you an example. We could go to the header JSX element here and add the class name prop and set this not to a hard-coded string, but instead to a dynamic value with curly braces and set it equal to classes.header. Now we can add a class named header, because here I am accessing header on classes, to this CSS file. And any styles we define in here would then only affect this component here. So if I save this and I gave this a red color, you see now that's colored red. And if I had another header class in another component, it would not be red because the styles are scoped, as I just explained. Now the goal is here not to make this red, but instead I prepared some other styles for you, which you find attached. You find a main navigation.module.css file attached, and you can simply replace your main navigation.module CSS file with mine. Now in here I defined a bunch of styles for you, and therefore we now just have to wire them up to the elements. We already added the header class to the header. On this div with the logo text, you should add classes.logo, and that's actually it already. And with that, if you save this, let me zoom out a bit, now we got this good looking navigation bar at the top here. By the way, it's not optimized for mobile, since this is not really a CSS course, but I want to focus on React instead. But now with that, we added this nice navigation bar, and we added it such that we have component-specific styles, which are also scoped to this component. Now that we added our styling in our navigation bar, let's work on the pages. Let's maybe start with the all meetups page, and let's output a list of dummy meetups for the moment, before we then make sure that we can add our own meetups. Now for this, I'll go to the all meetups.js file, and the goal in there is to get a list of meetups. Later, we will get it from a server by sending a HTTP request. For the moment, we'll work with some dummy meetups, and I then want to output those meetups. Now for this, I'll first of all add a constant named dummy data, which we'll replace later, which holds an array of dummy meetups. Now here I'll just add a bunch of JavaScript objects which hold the meetup data. Things like the image, the title, the description text, and the address maybe. And for this, you can definitely also use my code attachments. There you'll find some prepared dummy data. You can also prepare your own one. Here I just have two dummy objects, which have basically the same content, just different IDs and different titles, but the same image, the same address, the same description text, because of course it's not about the dummy data, but about what we do with it. Now one word about that image. I got that from Wikipedia. You can of course bring your own images. Here I got this nice looking image here, created by Thomas Wolf and not by me, so just to give him due credits. And you can of course bring your own image, just make sure that you simply get a URL to some image and store that in this image property of your dummy data points. Now we got the dummy data, now the goal is to output that data. So for this here in this div or a section, which we could also use, we can add a h1 tag, let's say, and say all meetups. And then below that, we want to output this data, but of course not as code like this, but instead as JSX elements. And for this, we now need to learn how we can render a list of JSX elements dynamically, how we can translate a list of data into a list of JSX elements. Because it is worth noting that in JSX, you can actually render an array of JSX elements like this. So output a dynamic expression with curly braces, then add an array, and in there you could have list items like item 1, and then as a second item, item 2. And if you do that, those are rendered. So arrays are rendered correctly, automatically by React. And that's important to know, because that means that if we can translate this array of objects into an array of JSX elements, we can output it down there. And there is a way for translating an array into an array of different data in JavaScript. On that dummy data array, we can call the built-in map method, which exists in JavaScript. And map allows us to execute a function. Here I'm writing an arrow function on every element in that array, and it will get this element as an input. So in this case, the meetup, let's say, as an input automatically, because this function is called automatically by JavaScript. And we then return the transformed data. And the result of calling map then is a new array full of that transformed data. And here we could say for every meetup object which we're getting, we want to return a list item. And hence we maybe actually wrap this all here with an unordered list. And in that list item, we want to output data about that meetup. For example, to begin with, to output the title. So here I'm dynamically outputting meetup title in this JSX code. So with that, we transform our array of objects into an array of li elements. And if we do that just like this, and we reload, we see this is a first and this is a second meetup. So that does work. Now there is one important note about lists though. If you open the developer tools, you'll see a warning here that each child in a list should have a unique key prop. That is a requirement by React, which it needs to update and render lists efficiently. I dive deeper into that in my React course. For the moment, it's enough to know that we should add the key prop here to the list item and then set this to some unique value per item. And we have a unique value for every list item here, the IDs. The IDs are different for every item. So here we can then set this to meetup.id. And with that, we'll no longer get that warning if we reload. So that is how we can render a list of data, simply by mapping it. And that is how you typically do render lists of data with React. But in the end, you can just render any array of JSX elements, no matter how you derived that array. Now, rendering our list like this is of course not our goal. We want to render a more beautiful, a more good-looking list. And for this, we could structure our code here differently and add more styling, but ultimately I simply want to create a new component here and add component-specific styling. So that's what we'll do. In the components folder, I'll add another subfolder next to layout and I'll name it meetups. And this holds all my meetup-specific code. And in there, I'll add a meetup item.js file and a meetup list.js file, because I want to outsource both the list as well as the individual list items into components. Because, as mentioned earlier, it is a good practice to split your components and your application as a whole into small, reusable pieces. Now let's start with the meetup item. In that file, we create our meetup item function, of course, as we did before, and we export that function. And then in here, we return a list item. And then in that list item, I want to have a div in which I render the image and set the source to something and the alt text to something. And then that's a self-closing element. And below that div, I have another div with the content, where I have a h3 tag with the title, an address tag, which is a default HTML tag, where I output the address later, and then a paragraph with the description. And all this hard-coded text will, of course, soon be replaced with dynamic data. And then below that, we can add another div with a button where we say to favorites, so that this adds the item to our favorites later. That's the general structure I want to have here. Now, as mentioned, title, address, and description, and also the data for the image should be dynamic. I don't want to hard code it here. Instead, it should be passed in from outside, from the so-called parent component, so the component where we use this component in its JSX code. And we learned how we can make that happen. We can accept props here and use props. And then, for example, for the image source, we could set this to props.image, expecting an image prop on the meetup item which holds that URL that should be set as a source here. And the same for the alt text, that could be our title. The title can also be used down there, so that we output props.title here. And for the address, it's props.address. For the description, it's props.description. And now all of a sudden this component is reusable and dynamic. Some styling would also be nice, and for that, again attached, you find CSS files here, the meetup item.module CSS and the meetup list.module CSS files, which you can copy in next to these JavaScript files. And then in meetup item.js, we want to import classes from /meetup item.module.css and assign a couple of classes in that JavaScript file. On the list item, for example, we'll add the item class like this. On this div, which is wrapped around the image, we'll add the image class like this. On the div, which is wrapped around the title and description and so on, we'll add the content class. And then down there for the button, I'll add a class of actions, like this. Now that's not all. I also want to work on that meetup list component already. So here we can again create another component, meetup list, and export that as a default. Also accept props here, because I expect to get that list data from outside as well. And I'm expecting this because I'm the one building this app. We could also write the code for fetching meetups in this component, but I instead want to make this component reusable and not care about the data source in here, but instead just expect that I get meetups through some prop, and then it's the component which uses the meetup list component that has to worry about getting the meetups. And I'm setting it up like this because I plan on using the meetup list component in the all meetups component and also in the favorites component later. And there we'll have different data sources, but the same way of displaying the data. And that's what we can make work by adding a separate reusable component. In here, I also already want to import classes from /meetup list.module.css and return an unordered list here, which receives a class name of classes.list, which is one of the only provided CSS class for this component. And inside of the unordered list here, I now want to output my meetup items in the same way as we did it in all meetups, by mapping an array of objects into an array of JSX elements. Just that the JSX elements will now be the list items. And for this here, we again add a dynamic expression with curly braces, and we can expect that on our props here in meetup list, we get, let's say, a meetups prop. The name is up to you because it's your component. This could also be named items, but here I'll go with meetups. And then I map every meetup into another object, into a JSX element to be precise. So therefore, using the arrow function shorthand syntax here, I'll transform every meetup into a meetup item. And for this, you need to add this import. It was automatically added for me here by the IDE. If that does not work for you, just add it manually and import meetup item from the meetup item file. Now we render one meetup item per object in the meetups array, and that now needs to be configured. It needs this key prop, this special prop React expects, one of the very few special props that are built into React and that can be used on any component, including your own components, without you writing any special code for it inside of your components. So you can just add that anywhere. And we set that equal to meetup.id. Then in my own component, I'll actually pass in the ID as well as an ID prop. We will use that later for the favorite feature. I'll pass in the image prop with meetup.image. Let me reformat this to make it a bit more readable. Add the title prop and point at meetup.title. And also add address and description. So meetup.address and description is equal to meetup.description. Now, alternatively, we could have also just passed in a meetup prop or any other name and just passed in the meetup as a whole. Then we would have to destructure it inside of the meetup item component. It's up to you which approach you prefer. Here I'm passing in individual props. With all of that done though, we can go back to all meetups and now use the meetup list component instead of the unordered list. So we go up and we import meetup list from going up one level out of the pages folder into the components folder, into the meetups folder to meetup list, and then just output meetup list like this, and very important, provide the meetups prop, because we're expecting that prop inside of the meetup list component here. So set up the meetups prop here and pass in the dummy data array as a value. With all of that done, if you save all the files, you should see something like this. Now, this is not the final look. We'll continue tweaking this, but it shows that our content is being rendered, and that's not too bad. But now it would be nice to kind of restrict the width which we use on the screen, and it would also be nice if the individual meetups would look like cards with a nice drop shadow, maybe rounded corners, something like that. That's what we're going to add next. Now let's start with that card look. In case it's not clear what I mean that look which we also used earlier for the first demo project, where we simply have a nice white background and a slight drop shadow. And I'd like to have that for every meetup item. Now we can solve this by adding a couple of CSS classes in the meetup item module CSS file, and then changing the look of our list item. That would work. But this card look is so common that we maybe also want to use it in other components of this application. And we will actually use it in other components later. That's why I want to create a separate reusable component, which should act as a wrapper around other components and just give those components some styling, which we then reuse. And for this, in the components folder, I'll add a new subfolder, which I just want to name UI for user interface. The name is up to you, of course. In there, I want to store some general user interface components, which don't belong to a specific feature, but instead are used in different places of the app. And here I'll add a card.js file, and attached you find a card module CSS file, which you can simply add next to this card.js file. And in the card.js file, we'll now create a component as we did it before, simple functional component, and export it, of course. And we'll also import the styling, import classes from /card.module.css. And then in the component function, return a simple div where we set the class name to classes.card. Now, the special thing about this component is that this should now be the first custom component which we can wrap around JSX content. Because the goal is to use this card component such that on a meetup item, inside of this list item, we can use card, and for this you need to add the import. So import card from going up one level, diving into UI, card. And we can wrap card around that JSX content, so that we can use the card component like this. That's the goal. But at the moment, if you save all files, the result is that you don't see anything. And the reason is that at the moment, this card component simply swallows everything we wrap and throws it away, you could say. Because this card component just renders a div, and it doesn't know what it should do with any wrapped content. Now, it's such a common case, though, that you build components that should wrap itself around more JSX content. So you could say that you want to inject JSX content into this component, that React, of course, has a solution for this case. And this solution, again, is related to props. We learned that we can pass props by adding attributes to an element, and that does work. But you can also add a special prop by passing content between the opening and closing tags. And that content is then exposed under that special prop inside of that wrapping component. So here we accept the props parameter again. And then between the div tags, I want to output props.children. Props.children is a special prop. The children prop is a special prop which every component receives by default. And children always holds the content which is passed between the opening and closing component tags. So this JSX content, that is the value stored in that children prop in this case, when we use card in this component like this. And now I'm just outputting the value stored in children between these div tags. And with that, if we reload, we now have this slight card look and we see a drop shadow here. Since we take up too much width, we don't see it perfectly, but we can see it a bit. And if we inspect this in the DevTools, we see that every meetup item here has this div with the card class. The name was transformed because of that CSS modules feature, but it has that div with a card class wrapped around these other divs, image, content, and actions, inside of the list item. So that wrapping works, and that is another very important technique when it comes to composing user interfaces with React components. And that's why we also cover it here. And we can now use this technique as well for setting up a general layout for this application. Because I'd like to have more white space around the content here. And for this, I'll go to the layout folder and add a layout component in there. Attached, you also find a layout module CSS file, which you can add next to this JavaScript file. And then here in layout.js, we can create a layout component function and export it as a default. And import classes here from /layout.module.css. And then in here, return our layout. And that could be a div with our main navigation, let's say. So from app.js, I'll cut main navigation and remove the import there. And instead in the layout component, I'll add that here. And therefore, of course, also add an import of main navigation from that main navigation JavaScript file, which is next to the layout file. And below that, we could use the regular main HTML element and then use the layout component such that we wrap it around the actual JSX code that should be rendered. So we could say that in app.js, we want to wrap the content selected and rendered by the router with our layout. So here in app.js, we can import layout from, going up, diving into the components folder, layout. And instead of having this useless wrapping div, we could use our own layout component for wrapping here. And now this content here, the actual route content, the page component that is being loaded, should be rendered inside of this main block. And we can again achieve this with props children. We can again accept props here and then output props.children here inside of the main element. And that will then just forward that content, which is between our layout tags, so this content here, into that main element. Now here we should also add a class name of classes.main for styling. And with that, if we save this, now we're utilizing this nice layout component for wrapping all our content. It's technically not required. We could have added the styling in another way too, but it is another nice practice of this children concept and it removes some extra code from our app component and makes sure that this component can focus on one main thing: rendering the routing configuration. Because your components typically should be focused on one thing. And now we got a leaner app component, and we're again using props children to create this layout component here. Now that we're able to render a couple of meetups there with help of our meetup list and meetup item components, it would of course be good if those meetups would not come from our dummy data source, but from an actual server. And they should actually end up on that server because we created them on the Add New Meetup page. After all, that's the goal of this demo application. That on this add page, we have a nice little form for entering data about a meetup. So entering this kind of data in the end. And then that data should be sent to some server, to some backend, where it's then also stored in a database, so that then it can be fetched and loaded in all meetups. By doing that, meetups that are added here could be shared with all visitors from all over the world, since data is stored in a database on some backend server, not just in our browser. And the data would also be there if we reload the page. If we just store data in memory, any data is lost if we reload the page because the JavaScript application restarts and the previous state is lost. And therefore, the first step is to add this form to this Add New Meetup page, so that then in a second step we can gather the entered data and send it to a server. And for this, we'll work in this new meetup.js file, which is the file that should render this meetup form. So in here, I'll actually also add a section and the h1 title of Add New Meetup. But then below that, I want to output the meetup form, which I will actually create and store in a separate file to, again, keep this new meetup page lean. Now, a good folder would be the meetups folder in the components folder. And therefore, in here, we can add a new file, the new meetup form file, for example, new meetup form.js. Now, attached again, you find a styling file for this file, the new meetup form.module.css, which you can just download and add next to this JavaScript file, so that you have some styles which I prepared for you. And in the new meetup form.js file, we now create another function because we're going to create another component, the new meetup form function and component, which, just as before, is exported here to make it available outside of this file. In the new meetup page component, below this title, we can then already add that new meetup form. Make sure you also add the appropriate import. Now, once you did add it, back in the new meetup form.js file, we can start with outputting the JSX code for the form. Now, I want to actually wrap this form again in this card to give it this card look. And that's why I created that separate card component before, so that we can now reuse that component. So now, besides using the card component in the meetup item component, we can also use it in the new meetup form, simply by using it here, and of course by importing it. You always need to import what you use in a file from the UI folder and the card file. Now, card will then be wrapped around the actual HTML form that we'll create, and then we'll, populate that form with various inputs. Now, I did provide that CSS file for the form, so let's also already import classes from /new meetup form.module.css to have these scoped styles. And we can start assigning classes on that form element where you should assign the form class like this. Now inside of this form, you can of course structure this however you want, but to fit the styles which I provided to you, I'll add a div with a class of classes control. And in that div, I want to have a label where we say meetup title, for example, for the first input we're going to add. Now that input is added here and it's of type text. It should be required so that we have that in-browser validation. And I will give it an ID of title and then self-close it. And now connect this label to this input by adding the for attribute, but just as class, for is a keyword in JavaScript, and therefore the actual property name for setting this for value or for setting this attribute here is HTML4. So I add HTML4 as a prop, and that's another exception besides class name, where you use an attribute name that deviates from the regular HTML attribute name. It's basically the only other important exception besides class name, which you have to memorize. And then we point at title here. And this simply connects this label to this title for screen readers and other assistive technologies. Now we have this input with this label here, and we can now repeat this entire control div multiple times to also render a label for the meetup image, and maybe use an ID of image here and change this to type URL, since the image set here should actually be a URL pointing at an image. If you're interested in uploading files with React, that is not really that much of a React task, but mostly a backend server task. And hence I discuss file uploads in my Node.js course, for example. But to learn how to make file uploads work with React, I also have a resource attached, a tutorial, which you can take a closer look at to learn how to upload files with React. Here, we'll not upload files, we'll just insert the URL of an existing image, which already exists on some server. Then we can replicate this div again for our address here, let's say, and the ID could be address. And here we'll again just have some plain text as an input type. And thereafter, I want to have one more control, which is the actual description of the meetup. And hence, we could use description as an ID. But here, I'll actually not render an input, but instead a text area, which is another default HTML element. It'll still get that ID description here. And it will also still get the required attribute for adding this in-browser validation, and I'll set rows to 5. That's another default attribute which we can add to text areas. Now last but not least, below that I'll add another div with a class name of classes actions, and in there I want to have the button that submits the form. So here we can add a button where we say add meetup, and that button will then submit that form. That's how HTML in the browser works. If you have a button in a form, a button which is not of type button, so if you have a regular button like this, then such a button will submit that form. And we can later listen to that submit event. And this should be actions as a class here. And with that, if you save that file, you should see this form on the screen. Now the form doesn't work yet, but it's there. Now to handle the form submission, we got to do two main things. We have to listen to the form submission, and we then actually have to prevent the browser default, which is that it sends a HTTP request automatically, and hence it would reload the page. We want to prevent this and instead handle the submission with JavaScript, with React. And in addition to that, we of course need to read the entered values. We need to get the actual input the user entered. Now let's start with the form submission. To listen for that submission, we can add the onSubmit prop on the form, because by default, a submit event will be emitted if you have a button in a form and that button is clicked, and we can then catch this submit event here and run our own logic with help of that onSubmit prop. Now I will add another nested function in the new meetup form component function, let's say the submit handler, which should be triggered when the submit event occurs by connecting function and onSubmit like this. But as I mentioned a couple of seconds ago, the default behavior of the browser would actually be that it sends a request to the server serving this page automatically. And we don't want that. We don't want that browser default. Instead, we want to prevent that default and run our own JavaScript logic. That might then still involve that we send a HTTP request later, but we want to send that request behind the scenes without reloading the page, which is what would happen if the browser does its default thing. Now, thankfully, preventing that browser default is simple. We will get an event object automatically here, because all those built-in events like onClick, onSubmit, and all the other events to which we can listen, for all those events, React will automatically pass an event argument into the function that is executed for those events. This argument, which we can accept here as a parameter. And this event object will have a prevent default method which we can call to prevent the browser default. That's actually not even React specific. This event object and this method, that is vanilla JavaScript, which is fully supported by React. So that will prevent that browser default and will allow us to fully handle the submission with just JavaScript and React. So that's step one. Now we need to find a way of reading those entered values. For reading the entered values, we got two main ways of handling this. We can use state again and add the onChange event listener to all those inputs, which will in the end trigger a function for every keystroke, and then we can extract that value the user entered from the event object which will receive for that event and update our state for that given input with the entered value. That would allow us to keep track of what the user entered with every keystroke. But here I'm actually only interested in the user input once when the form is submitted. And for this we can use another concept built into React, the concept of refs. Now ref stands for reference, and React simply allows us to set up references to DOM elements, so we can get direct access to DOM elements. To set up such a reference, such a connection, we first of all have to import the useRef hook from React. So just like useState, that's another built-in special function offered by React, which we can execute in our functional components. And we can execute useRef here. And with that, we create a ref object, a reference object. We can store this in a constant, and we could name it title input ref, because my first ref here should be for this title input. Now to connect this created object to this input, we add another special prop to this HTML element. Another special prop besides the key prop, which is built into React and supported on all elements out of the box. And that's the ref prop. We add the ref prop to this input, and as a value, we point at this title input ref. This will establish a connection and will give us access to this input element through this ref object. So here in this submit handler, we can then get the entered title, so the concrete value the user entered, by using that title input ref, and then there actually .current, all those ref objects created with the useRef work such that they have a current property, which then holds the actual connected value. And therefore it's .current, which then holds this input element object, the JavaScript representation of that input element. And all those input elements have a value property. That's just how JavaScript works. The JavaScript object representing an input element has a value property, and that value property holds the currently entered value of that input. So that's how we can extract what the user entered. We could also change it. We could set value to some new value, but we shouldn't really do that. If you want to change what's output on the screen, use state for that instead. But for reading input, for reading values, refs can be a very useful tool. And here we are reading what the user entered. Now we can repeat that for the other inputs, simply by creating more refs. You can have more than one ref per component. So here I also create the image input ref like this, and I'll already copy that a couple of times, and also create the address input ref and the description input ref. And then we connect those refs with the ref property here on the image. We connect this to image input ref. For the address, we connect this to address input ref. And on the text area, which is there to enter a description, we connect the description input ref. Now with that, we can extract all those entered values in the submit handler. So we get the entered image with image input ref .current .value. We got the entered address with the address input ref .current .value. And we got the entered description by using the description input ref current .value. And that then allows us to create a new object, let's say, the meetup data object, which then has a couple of keys, like let's say title, and stores those entered values as values. So the entered title for the title key, for the image key I store the entered image, for the address key let's say we store the entered address, and for the description key we store the entered description. And now for the moment I'll simply log that meetup data with console log. Soon we will send it to a server instead. But for the moment, let's just see if that works. And hence, if I now go back and open up the DevTools here and reload, we can enter something here like a test. And then here's some URL. Let me just grab that dummy image URL from my dummy meetup data in the all meetups.js file and insert that here without quotes. Some test address 12345 test city, and then this is a test. And if we now click add meetup, we see this object here on the right, which is the object with all the entered data. So submitting the form and handling the submission, preventing the browser default, and gathering all the user input, all of that works now. And that is how we can handle forms with React. Now, of course, the goal is not to just log the data here, though. Instead, we now want to send it to a server, which then stores it in a database.